The morning mist clung to the St. Lawrence River like a ghostly shroud as Major General James Wolfe stood aboard HMS Sutherland, his piercing eyes fixed upon the towering cliffs of Quebec City. It was the summer of 1759, and the fate of two empires hung in the balance. The young British commander, barely 32 years of age, carried upon his narrow shoulders the weight of Britain's most ambitious campaign in the New World. Quebec City rose from the river like a medieval fortress, its stone walls gleaming, pale gray in the early light. The citadel, perched atop Cape Diamond, commanded the St. Lawrence River Valley, serving as the beating heart of New France. For over a century, this bastion had remained unconquered, its French defenders confident. In the natural barriers that surrounded their stronghold, the cliffs rose nearly 200 feet above the water, seemingly impregnable to any attacking force. Wolfe had sailed from England, with a formidable armada, 49 warships and transport vessels carrying nearly 9,000 troops. British Admiralty had spared no expense for this crucial expedition. Vice Admiral Charles Saunders commanded the naval forces, his fleet representing the finest vessels in the Royal Navy. The soldiers aboard represented the cream of British military might, including seasoned regiments that had proven themselves in European campaigns. The French defenders, under the command of Lieutenant General Louis-Joseph de Montcalm-Gozon, Marquis de Montcalm, possessed intimate knowledge of the terrain and the advantage of prepared positions. Montcalm, a veteran of numerous European battles, understood that Quebec's survival meant the survival of French power in North America. His forces, though outnumbered, included regular French troops, Canadian militia, and Native American allies, who knew every trail and hiding place in the surrounding wilderness, as reported by contemporary military historians and documented in the British archives. The strategic importance of Quebec cannot be overstated in the context of the 7 Years' War. The city controlled the primary route into the heart of New France, and its capture would effectively sever French Canada from its lifeline to Europe. The British government, under the leadership of William Pitt the Elder, had committed unprecedented resources to this campaign, viewing it as the decisive stroke that would end French colonial power in North America. The siege began in earnest during the last days of June 1759. British artillery positions sprouted along the southern shore of the St. Lawrence, their cannons sending thunderous salvos across the water. The bombardment continued day and night, reducing much of the lower town to rubble. Civilians huddled in cellars and caves, while French soldiers maintained their vigilant watch from the ramparts above. Wolfe's initial attempts to establish a foothold on the north shore met with fierce resistance. The Battle of Montmorency Falls in late July demonstrated the formidable nature of French defenses. British grenadiers and light infantry launched a frontal assault against French positions, only to be repelled with heavy casualties. The red-coated soldiers stumbled through muddy tidal flats under withering fire from concealed French marksmen. As summer progressed into early autumn, frustration mounted within the British ranks. The siege had stretched far longer than anticipated, and seasonal weather patterns threatened to trap the British fleet in increasingly dangerous waters. Ice would soon begin forming on the St. Lawrence, making naval operations impossible. Wolfe faced a stark reality. He must achieve victory soon, or abandon the campaign entirely, potentially dooming British hopes for continental dominance in North America. September arrived with crisp mornings and the first hints of autumn colors, painting the maple forests surrounding Quebec. Time was running short for the British forces, and Major General Wolfe found himself grappling with increasingly desperate circumstances. His health, never robust, had deteriorated significantly during the grueling summer campaign. Commander suffered from rheumatism, kidney stones, and a persistent fever that left him weak and irritable. The British camp along the Isle of Orleans buzzed with tension and uncertainty. Officers gathered in hushed conferences, studying maps and debating strategies that might crack the French defenses. Traditional military doctrine suggested that Quebec was virtually impregnable from direct assault, yet Wolfe refused to accept defeat. His reputation, built upon previous victories at Louisbourg and in European campaigns, depended upon finding a solution to this seemingly impossible challenge. Montcalm, spurring the British forces from his command post within the citadel, felt cautiously optimistic about his defensive position. The French commander had successfully repelled multiple British attacks throughout the summer, inflicting heavy casualties while preserving his own forces. His strategy centered upon maintaining defensive positions while awaiting the arrival of winter weather that would force the British fleet to withdraw from the St. Lawrence River. The French defensive network extended far beyond Quebec's stone walls. Montcalm had positioned troops at strategic points along the river, creating a series of interlocking defensive positions. The Beauport shore, stretching eastward from Quebec City, bristled with fortifications and entrenchments. French soldiers had spent months preparing these positions, creating fields of fire that would devastate any attacking force attempting to land on the beaches below. Canadian militia units, familiar with wilderness warfare techniques learned from their Native American allies, conducted constant reconnaissance missions against British positions. These skilled fighters moved through the forest like shadows, gathering intelligence and harassing British supply lines. Their intimate knowledge of local terrain provided the French with significant advantages in planning defensive operations, as documented in period military correspondence and strategic analyses. Wolfe began considering increasingly unconventional approaches to breaking the siege deadlock. His brigadiers, Robert Monckton, George Townshend, and James Murray, pressed him to consider alternative landing sites that might avoid the heavily fortified Beauport shore. Intelligence reports suggested the existence of a narrow path leading up the cliffs west of Quebec City, though French scouts reportedly guarded this potential route. The path in question, known locally as the Anse au Fallon, represented a calculated risk of enormous proportions. The cliff face rose nearly 175 feet above the St. Lawrence River, and the path itself was little more than a goat track, carved into the rock face by years of erosion and occasional use by local inhabitants. French sentries maintained watch over this approach, though their vigilance had perhaps grown complacent after months of routine duty. Captain William Dillon of the Royal Navy conducted covert reconnaissance missions along the river, using small boats under cover of darkness to examine potential landing sites. His reports indicated that French defensive positions west of Quebec appeared less concentrated than those protecting the Beauport shore. However, the technical challenges of moving troops up the cliff face would require precise coordination and considerable luck. British naval forces under Admiral Saunders' command maintained their position in the St. Lawrence despite growing concerns about seasonal weather patterns. The admiral understood that his fleet represented Wolfe's only means of supply, an eventual evacuation should the campaign fail. Ice formation typically began in November, creating treacherous navigation conditions that could trap the entire expedition. Within Quebec City, civilian morale remained relatively high despite months of constant bombardment. French administrators had stockpiled sufficient supplies to sustain the garrison through a winter siege. Though the destruction of the lower town had displaced hundreds of families, Governor-General Pierre de Rigaud de Vaudreuil maintained civil authority while coordinating closely with Montcalm on military matters. Though tensions between the two commanders occasionally surfaced over strategic priorities, the 13th of September, 1759, dawned gray and misty over the St. Lawrence River. Major General Wolfe had made his fateful decision during the dark hours before sunrise, committing his forces to the most audacious military gamble of the entire campaign. The British fleet moved silently through the pre-dawn darkness, carrying approximately 4,500 soldiers toward their destiny at the Anse au Fallon. Wolfe himself sat in the lead boat, his frail figure wrapped in his scarlet military cloak. The young general had spent the previous evening in quiet contemplation, perhaps sensing that this day would determine not only the fate of his expedition but also his own mortality. Legends suggest that he recited portions of Thomas Gray's elegy, written in a country churchyard to his fellow officers, particularly the haunting line about paths of glory led but to the grave. The boats moved downstream with the tide, their oars muffled with cloth to prevent detection by French sentries. British light infantry regiments filled the vessels, their faces blackened with soot and their equipment secured to prevent any telltale sounds These were veteran soldiers, men who had proven themselves in previous campaigns and understood the desperate nature of their current mission. French sentries along the riverbank remained largely unaware of the approaching British force. The darkness provided excellent concealment, while the sound of flowing water masked the movement of boats. A French patrol boat challenged the British advance guard, but quick-thinking British officers responded in French, claiming to be supply vessels bound for Quebec City. The deception succeeded, allowing the expedition to proceed undetected. As the first British soldiers reached the base of the cliffs at Anse au Fallon, the true magnitude of their challenge became apparent. The rock face rose almost vertically from the water's edge, offering only scattered handholds and narrow ledges for climbing. Captain William Delaune had identified this location during his reconnaissance missions. Actually scaling the cliff in darkness with full military equipment represented an entirely different proposition. Light infantry companies began the ascent immediately, their officers leading by example. The climb required both physical strength and considerable courage, as a single misstep could send a soldier tumbling to his death on the rocks below. Ropes were secured at regular intervals to assist subsequent waves of troops, while advance parties worked to silence French sentries guarding the clifftop path. According to military historians and battlefield archaeology, as documented in Canadian historical archives, the first British soldiers to reach the top of the cliffs encountered minimal resistance from surprised French guards. A small detachment of Canadian militia maintained watch over the Anse au Fallon, but they had grown complacent after months of routine duty. The sudden appearance of British soldiers emerging from the cliff face caught them completely off guard. By sunrise, nearly 3,000 British troops had successfully scaled the cliffs and formed up on the plains of Abraham, the plateau stretching westward from Quebec City. This remarkable feat of military engineering and courage had placed a substantial British force in position to threaten Quebec from its most vulnerable approach. The element of surprise had been achieved, but now Wolfe faced the challenge of defeating Montcalm's army in open battle. The plains of Abraham stretched before the British forces like a natural battlefield. Its relatively flat terrain, ideal for the linear tactics favored by 18th-century European armies. Wolfe deployed his regiments in the traditional battle line, with the 43rd Regiment of Foot on the right flank, did 28th Regiment in the center, and the 47th Regiment anchoring the left. Light infantry companies extended the flanks, while reserves remained available to exploit any breakthrough. French lookouts within Quebec City spotted the British deployment shortly after dawn, sending urgent messages to Montcalm's headquarters. The French commander faced an immediate crisis. British forces now threatened Quebec from the landward side, forcing him to abandon his carefully prepared defensive positions along the Beauport shore and engage in open battle on terrain chosen by his enemy. Lieutenant General Montcalm received the shocking news of the British landing while breaking his fast in his quarters within the citadel. The initial reports seemed almost impossible to believe. How could thousands of British soldiers have scaled the supposedly impregnable cliffs without detection? Yet as additional messengers arrived with confirmation of the British deployment on the plains of Abraham, the French commander realized that his worst strategic nightmare had become reality. The situation demanded immediate action. Though Montcalm faced several critical disadvantages, his forces were scattered across multiple defensive positions, with significant contingents still manning the Beauport shore fortifications. Recalling these troops and redeploying them to face the British threat would consume precious hours, during which Wolfe could strengthen his position and potentially receive reinforcements from the British fleet below. Governor-General Vaudreuil argued for a more cautious approach, suggesting that French forces should consolidate within Quebec's fortifications and await the arrival of additional troops from Montreal and other outlying posts. However, Montcalm understood that delay would only strengthen the British position, potentially allowing Wolfe to establish artillery batteries that could bombard Quebec City from the landward side. The French army that assembled to face the British threat represented a diverse coalition of regular troops, Canadian militia, and Native American allies. French marine companies and regiments of the line formed the backbone of Montcalm's force. Their white uniforms and disciplined formations reflecting European military traditions. Canadian militia units brought intimate knowledge of local terrain and wilderness fighting techniques, while Native American warriors provided mobility and reconnaissance capabilities. As the morning progressed, both armies prepared for what would become one of the most decisive battles in North American history. British soldiers checked their muskets and bayonets, their red coats standing out starkly against the autumn landscape. The Brown Bess musket, standard issue for British infantry, represented the pinnacle of 18th century military technology, capable of accurate fire at ranges up to 100 yards. Wolfe deployed his forces with characteristic attention to tactical detail. The British battle line stretched across the Plains of Abraham, its flanks secured by natural obstacles and light infantry screens. Each regiment maintained the standard two-rank formation, allowing maximum firepower delivery while preserving unit cohesion. Artillery pieces laboriously hauled up the cliff face during the early morning hours. Provided additional firepower support, French forces began arriving on the battlefield in piecemeal fashion as Montcalm struggled to coordinate the movement of troops from scattered defensive positions. The Regiment de Berne, Regiment de Guienne, and other regular units took their positions in the French battle line, while Canadian militia and Native American allies extended the flanks and prepared to exploit any opportunities for flanking movements. Contemporary military accounts and battlefield studies documented in the Journal of the Royal United Service Institution describe the tactical situation as Montcalm faced it on that fateful morning. The French commander possessed approximate parity in numbers with Wolfe's forces, but his troops were tired from rapid movement and lacked the unified deployment that characterized the British position. Time pressures prevented proper reconnaissance of British dispositions, forcing Montcalm to rely upon hasty battlefield assessments. The psychological dimensions of the impending battle weighed heavily upon both commanders. Wolfe understood that defeat would mean not only personal disgrace, but also the failure of Britain's most ambitious North American campaign. His health continued to deteriorate, and he had confided to his officers that he expected to die in the coming battle. Montcalm faced equally desperate circumstances. Knowing that the loss of Quebec would effectively end French power in North America, artillery exchanges began around 10 o'clock in the morning, as both sides tested their opponents' positions and sought to identify weaknesses in enemy formations. British naval guns, positioned on ships in the St. Lawrence River, provided additional support by bombarding French positions within Quebec City. The thunderous roar of cannon fire echoed across the Plains of Abraham, while clouds of white smoke drifted across the battlefield as the French army completed its deployment. Montcalm made the crucial decision to attack immediately rather than wait for additional reinforcements. His reasoning reflected both tactical necessity and personal temperament. Delay would only strengthen the British position. While aggressive action might exploit the apparent British isolation from their fleet-based supply lines, at approximately 10 o'clock on the morning of September 13th, 1759, Montcalm gave the order that would echo through history. The French battle line, stretching nearly half a mile across the Plains of Abraham, began its advance toward the waiting British forces. Drums beat the pas de charge as approximately 4,000 French soldiers, Canadian militia, and native American allies moved forward in what would become one of the most famous advances in military history. The French advance began with characteristic élan, as regular regiments maintained their formation, while Canadian militia and native warriors sought to exploit cover and terrain features. The Regiment de Berne and Regiment de Guienne, veteran units with distinguished service records in European campaigns, anchored the center of the French line. Their white uniforms and regimental colors provided a striking contrast to the autumn. The landscape of the Plains of Abraham. Wolfe, despite his deteriorating health, moved along the British line to encourage his soldiers. The young general's presence had an electrifying effect upon the troops, who had witnessed his personal courage. Throughout the summer campaign, British discipline, honed through years of European warfare, would now face its ultimate test against French determination and Canadian wilderness fighting skills. As the French forces advanced to within musket range, the character of the battle began to shift. Canadian militia and Native American allies, skilled in individual marksmanship, began picking off British officers and sergeants. This targeted fire disrupted British formations and threatened to undermine the disciplined volleys that represented the core of British tactical doctrine. The British response demonstrated the tactical evolution that had made them masters of 18th-century battlefields. Instead of firing by companies or battalions, British regiments delivered coordinated volleys by ranks, creating devastating waves of musket fire that swept across the advancing French formations. The Brown Bess musket, while inaccurate at long range, proved devastatingly effective when employed in massed volleys at close quarters. British light infantry companies, positioned on the flanks and in advanced positions, engaged in running firefights with Canadian militia and native warriors. These skirmishes, while secondary to the main battle, demonstrated the tactical flexibility that British forces had developed through their North American experiences. Light infantry tactics borrowed from wilderness warfare complemented traditional European linear formations. According to period military analyses and archaeological evidence documented in the Bulletin of the Fort Ticonderoga Association, the decisive moment of the battle came when French regular regiments reached point-blank range of the British line. The disciplined British volleys, delivered at ranges of less than 50 yards, created gaps in the French formations that could not be filled by individual courage or tactical skill. Montcalm, leading from the front, in the tradition of European officers, received a mortal wound as his horse carried him toward the British lines. The French commander, struck by musket balls in the stomach and thigh, managed to remain mounted long enough to organize a fighting withdrawal toward Quebec City. His wounding effectively ended French offensive capabilities and transformed an organized attack into a desperate retreat. Wolfe, meanwhile, had been struck by 3 separate musket balls during the climactic moments of the battle. The British commander received wounds to the wrist, stomach, and chest, the final shot proving fatal. Legend records his last words as expressing satisfaction that the French forces were retreating. Though historically accurate accounts of his final moments remain disputed, the death of both commanding generals within minutes of each other created a unique, acute situation in military history. British forces, now under the command of Brigadier Robert Monckton, who had also been wounded, pressed their advantage while French forces retreated toward Quebec City under increasingly desperate circumstances. The Plains of Abraham had been won, but at tremendous cost to both sides. French casualties, while difficult to establish precisely, included not only Montcalm, but also hundreds of regular soldiers and Canadian militia. Native American allies, following traditional warfare patterns, began withdrawing from the battlefield once the outcome became clear. The retreat toward Quebec City quickly degenerated into a rout as British forces pursued with bayonets fixed. The tactical lessons of the battle would influence military thinking for generations. The effectiveness of disciplined volleys against advancing formations reinforced European linear tactics, while the performance of light infantry demonstrated the value of tactical flexibility. The battle also highlighted the crucial importance of unified command and the devastating effect of losing key leadership at critical moments. The immediate aftermath of the Battle of the Plains of Abraham witnessed scenes of both triumph and tragedy that would resonate through the corridors of history. British forces, though victorious, found themselves leaderless with the death of Major General Wolfe and the wounding of Brigadier Robert Monckton. Command fell to Brigadier George Townshend, who faced the enormous challenge of capitalizing upon the hard-won victory while dealing with significant casualties among his officer corps. French forces retreated in considerable disorder toward Quebec City, their morale shattered by the death of Montcalm and the devastating effectiveness of British volleys. The Marquis de Montcalm, carried from the battlefield with mortal wounds, was taken to the residence of Surgeon Arnoux within the city walls. The French commander, despite his grievous injuries, retained sufficient consciousness to provide final instructions for the defense of Quebec and to dictate his last letter to General Amherst. Montcalm died during the early morning hours of September 14th, 1759, approximately 18 hours after receiving his fatal wounds. His death removed not only a capable military commander, but also a unifying figure. who had successfully coordinated the efforts of French regular troops, Canadian militia, and Native American allies. Contemporary accounts describe his final hours as marked by concern for his soldiers and regret that he would not witness the resolution of the siege. The British Army, despite its victory, faced significant challenges in exploiting their success. Casualties among the officer corps had been severe, with many company and regimental commanders killed or wounded during the climactic moments of the battle. British soldiers, exhausted by their night approach march and the intensity of the mornings, fighting required time to reorganize before attempting to capitalize upon their tactical success. Governor-General Vaudreuil, assuming overall command of French forces following Montcalm's death, faced an impossible strategic situation. Quebec City's landward defenses had been breached, British forces controlled the Plains of Abraham, and French morale had been severely damaged by the loss of their most respected military leader. The remaining French garrison, while still numerous, lacked the unified leadership necessary for effective resistance. The civilian population within Quebec City endured tremendous psychological pressure as British forces established positions within sight of the city walls. Months of bombardment had already reduced much of the lower town to rubble, while the defeat on the Plains of Abraham raised the specter of direct assault against the remaining fortifications. Food supplies, while adequate for the immediate term, would become critical if the siege extended into winter months. British naval forces under Admiral Saunders provided crucial support during the critical hours following the battle. Naval gunfire from the St. Lawrence River prevented French attempts to counterattack British positions, while boats ferried wounded soldiers and additional supplies to support the forces ashore. The coordination between British land and naval forces demonstrated the strategic advantages of amphibious operations in North American campaigns, as documented in period military correspondence and strategic assessments preserved in the Public Record Office. The Battle of the Plains of Abraham represented a tactical victory of limited strategic significance until Quebec City itself surrendered. French forces still controlled the citadel and could potentially maintain resistance through the approaching winter months, particularly if relief expeditions arrived from Montreal or other French strongholds. The negotiation process began within days of the battle, as both sides recognized the altered strategic situation. French officials understood that continued resistance would likely prove futile, while British commanders needed to secure Quebec City before seasonal weather patterns forced their fleet to withdraw from the St. Lawrence River. Brigadier Townshend, though inexperienced in independent command, proved capable of managing the complex diplomatic and military requirements. Terms of capitulation were formally agreed upon on September 18, 1759, 5 days after the decisive battle. The agreement allowed French soldiers to march out with military honors before being transported to France, while Canadian militia were permitted to return to their homes. Upon swearing allegiance to the British Crown, civilian inhabitants retained their property rights and religious freedoms, provisions that would significantly influence the future development of British North America. The surrender ceremony took place with appropriate military pageantry, though the deaths of both commanding generals cast a somber tone over the proceedings. British forces occupied Quebec City in orderly fashion, establishing military government while respecting the terms of capitulation. The French fleur-de-lis was lowered from the citadel flagstaff, replaced by the British Union Jack in a ceremony that marked the effective end of French power in the St. Lawrence River Valley. The capture of Quebec City on September 18, 1759, marked not merely the end of a siege, but the beginning of a fundamental transformation that would reshape the destiny of North America. The British victory, purchased with the lives of both commanding generals, established British control over the strategic heart of New France and set in motion political, cultural, and social changes that continue to influence the continent too. This day, news of Wolfe's victory and death reached London in mid-October, creating a sensation that combined national triumph with personal tragedy. King George II reportedly declared upon hearing the news that Wolfe had died gloriously. While the British public embraced the young general as a romantic hero who had sacrificed his life for national glory, artists and poets celebrated Wolfe's sacrifice, most notably Benjamin West's famous painting The Death of General Wolfe, which transformed a military victory into an iconic image of heroic death. The strategic implications of Quebec's capture extended far beyond the immediate military situation. British forces now controlled the St. Lawrence River Valley, effectively severing New France from its European supply lines and isolating remaining French strongholds in the Great Lakes region and Louisiana Territory. The capture of Quebec City represented the crucial link in a chain of British victories that would culminate in the complete conquest of New France by 1760. French efforts to recapture Quebec during the spring of 1760 demonstrated the continued resilience of New France, though ultimately proved unsuccessful. The Battle of Sainte-Foy in April 1760 saw French forces under the Chevalier de Lévis defeat British troops commanded by Brigadier James Murray, temporarily besieging the British garrison within Quebec City. However, the arrival of British naval reinforcements in May 1760 ended French hopes of reversing the previous year's defeat. The Treaty of Paris, signed on February 10, 1763, formally ended the 7 Years' War and transferred New France to British control. The treaty's provisions reflected the strategic importance of the Quebec campaign, as France ceded all North American territories east of the Mississippi River to Great Britain. The former French colony of Quebec became a British possession, beginning a complex process of political and cultural adaptation that would define Canadian history, but British colonial administration faced enormous challenges in governing the former French territories, particularly in accommodating the Catholic French-speaking population within a Protestant British legal and political framework. The Quebec Act of 1774 addressed many of these concerns by guaranteeing religious freedom and maintaining French civil law, decisions that proved crucial during the American Revolutionary War, when Quebec remained loyal to the British Crown. The cultural legacy of the Battle of Quebec extended far beyond immediate political considerations. French-Canadian society, while adapting to British rule, maintained its distinct identity through language, religion, and legal traditions. This cultural persistence would eventually contribute to the development of Canadian federalism and bilingual national character. The battle thus marked not the end of French influence in North America, but rather its transformation from political dominance to cultural continuity. According to historical analyses and demographic studies documented in the Canadian Historical Review, the British conquest fundamentally altered immigration patterns and economic development in North America. British and American settlers began moving into former French territories, while existing French communities adapted to new political and economic realities. The fur trade, previously dominated by French merchants and Native American allies, gradually shifted toward British commercial networks. The military lessons of the Quebec campaign influenced tactical and strategic thinking throughout the remainder of the 18th century. The successful British amphibious operation demonstrated the advantages of naval support in North American warfare, while the decisive nature of the Plains of Abraham battle reinforced the effectiveness of disciplined, linear tactics. European military observers studied the campaign. It's an example of successful power projection across oceanic distances. The personal stories of those who fought and died on the Plains of Abraham became part of both British and French national mythologies. Wolfe's heroic death inspired generations of British military officers, while Montcalm's gallant defense of Quebec earned respect from both allies and enemies. These individual narratives transformed a colonial military campaign into an epic struggle between competing visions of North American development. The Battle of Quebec and its aftermath established patterns of Anglo-French cooperation and competition that would define North American development for centuries. The survival of French-Canadian culture within British North America created a unique bicultural society. While the strategic lessons of the campaign influenced subsequent military operations during the American Revolutionary War, War of 1812, and other conflicts, modern Quebec City preserves numerous monuments and historical sites commemorating the 1759 campaign, recognizing both British and French contributions to the region's development. The Plains of Abraham, now a historic park, serves as a reminder of the battle's significance while providing space for reflection upon the complex legacy of conquest, accommodation, and cultural continuity that defines Canadian history. The Battle of Quebec thus stands as more than a military engagement. It represents a pivotal moment when the trajectory of North American development shifted decisively toward British influence while preserving elements of French culture that continue to enrich the continental heritage. The deaths of Wolfe and Montcalm, tragic in personal terms, symbolize the passing of one era and the beginning of another, marking September 13th, 1759, as truly one of history's most significant dates.